But if you are under assault, you say, stop the assault first, and then we'll talk, right?
Mm-hmm.
And here, I remember when I told you, okay, what were the circumstances of this book? You know, I was called by the Boston Review. It's a very well-established journal in the U.S., and they asked me if I would address the place of tolerance in Islam. And automatically, the question was, well, why? Is it because you want me to prove that Islam is a tolerant religion? And he said, well, the editors, particularly Josh Cohen at the time, said, well, my approach is because we need to be educated about what are the discourses on this issue within the tradition of Islam. We need to be eavesdroppers, is actually the expression. We sort of need to spy on what is going on within the Islamic tradition there. And if you do not mind us sort of being like observers to the internal discourse, that would be a wonderful thing. And my response was, from that perspective, I accept that it is, I am talking about the discourse from within, and it's as if you come and you're sitting and you're observing, listening, learning, and so on. And that's why that I wrote the essay. Well, after I wrote the essay, for some reason it generated a huge response. People were writing in all these letters. Some of the people who are in the book, but apparently more than that, much more than that. And the responses just ranged from saying there is no discourse on tolerance in Islam. This is nonsense, and citing the jihad verse abrogated everything, and that's Islam. And how don't you know about the law of Dhimma? Ultimately, this guy called Kumash wrote a book, Islamic Imperialism, to say, but regardless of how you read the history, it does not change the fact of an ethical, doctrinal debate from within. For instance, in a later article, I talk about a juristic, it's actually theological discourse about whether when you fight non-Muslims, you fight them because of their lack of belief, or do you fight them لدفع الصائل, to remove the threat that they pose to you? So are you fighting to keep yourself, or to make yourself safe, or are you punishing them for their lack of belief? And not surprisingly, there is a debate, right? It's an intense debate, and it's a debate between those who say no, you cannot stand judge and executor, and the war is not to punish people for. And anyway, the Quran says that the world will never become all Muslim, and so on. And even things that of course, hate mongers love to point to, when Shaybani, his early opinion that at least once a year you wage jihad. Even that view it's so contested that at different times after the Crusades, theologians were pulling their hair out because they were trying to convince Muslims to wage any jihad whatsoever. and not leave alone once a year. I mean, so even that judgment, or the whole debate about whether peace treaties can be 10 years or so. I mean, this is an ongoing normative, ethical, legal discourse, and it is very the dangerous thing, whether from Muslim or non-Muslim, is to come in, take a snapshot of a moment of history from a particular angle, and to say, I've learned the truth. You know, how much do you know from there? It's nothing. It's just really all you have is a snapshot from an angle. And the first step is to let people know that there is a process, there is a discourse. The second step, which I would like to engage, I mean, I engaged in speaking God's name, but I wish I could dedicate my life to, is to actually make a normative contribution to the documentation of a discourse. The political climate, the place where the political climate really does make a difference is that the antagonistic political climate, the constant tension, it puts a scholar at a point where they are always documenting the existence of a discourse, but unable to get to the next step. Because just for people to accept the existence of a motion picture within Islamic history is such an intellectual or a leap that if they do that, then there's very little interest or patience to then go on for an actual affirmative, normative, ethical position, siding with this or that, but in many ways, then this is sort of the story of modern Islam in the past few centuries. It is, constantly this a few steps taken forward, nullified by overwhelming political circumstances that make these steps seem so irrelevant and insignificant. I mean, look at Muhammad Iqbal and what happened in Pakistan after Muhammad Iqbal. I mean, Muhammad Iqbal at one point looked like a whole school of thought that could shoot out. Or Shah Waliullah, I think, is actually one of my favorite examples because of the complexity of this man's thought and the subtlety. And yet, they're completely aborted shortly after. But that doesn't mean they're permanently aborted. This is a critical difference, is that aborted meaning that not sufficient attention paid to them under the current circumstances within this century or the next century. But there is no question that the possibility remains. God knows how long after. The returning to these normative discourses and co-opting them and the reformulation, and in other words, putting back steam into these normative positions. And you remember when I told you about the debate I had with one of my mentors about whether you sort of break yourself from the public and you write books for future generations, or you engage. To his point is, get to the normative contribution and leave it for the generations to come. Until the circumstances are such that people would have the energy and the attention to focus on the normative contributions. That takes a certain demeanor, I think, because you have to sort of detach yourself from the educational, more elementary educational message of listen, people, you're making judgments about things you don't know. The things are far more complicated. The more telling them that there's a movie, there's actually a movie or a film rather than just these snapshots taken at different. I don't know. I mean, I think every one of you will ultimately have to confront this question in their own career. There's no. I mean, I always tell my graduate students that there's no doubt you will have to. Now, how do you balance it? How do you ultimately come down on it? I think that's the one thing that is in both, whether you're writing for future generations or you're writing right now, notice that everything rests on the subtlety of mind and spirit, that in knowing that the text, the discourse that you are engaging is at the moment that you're engaging it, you are engaging in but a snapshot. And if you have the subtlety of mind and spirit, you know that if you study long enough, if you actually do your homework, what starts forming in your intellect is a group of shots that start creating a moving picture. But it's very partial, because it's a moving picture that's often very chunky and jumps 200 years and you don't know what's happening and so on. But it is within an educational there is no, that in itself, I believe that is a priori ethical question, because it has to do with shahada, with attesting to the truth in itself. I mean, it's so from a theological perspective, it cannot be sidestepped or marginalized.
Can I ask a question? When Nico Schreurs, who was professor of dogmatic theology, retired here, his farewell lecture was called "Dogmatics: a series of moving pictures."
Oh, really?
And
interesting.
One of the remarks he made, and he made that before, according to him, fundamentalism is the reaction to the insight that you are talking about snapshots, but even that those snapshots are never really sharp. They're always a bit blurred. And that causes such kind of uncertainty that people long for something that is clear, that has a clear shape, that you know what it is, and that by having the snapshot, you are not adding something to the movie, but you have finished the movie. Is that not, would that also in your opinion be one of the root causes of fundamentalism?
Yeah, I mean, this is I mean, this is the whole anti-intellectualism of fundamentalism. It rests in I think, and this is a really nice way of putting it, because it is when you can or I can know which particular texts are relied on by fundamentalists, and not just which particular text, but which parts of the text are relied on. So I know, for instance, that Minhaj al-Sunnah, only 5 pages out of this fairly huge book are ever quoted. The rest is it presents the picture starts getting more and more complicated and so on. Or Ibn Taymiyyah's work on aql and on the relationship between reason and sharia, 11 volumes of extremely dense discourse. That is, of course, always, no one ever pays any attention to it. But at the same time, even Ibn Qayyim's something like Zad al-Ma'ad or A'lam al-Muqa'in, you know what part of the text is going to be time and time and time and time and time again, they're going to go to. Even in books of hadith, it's the same. So you know that Riyadh al-Salihin by an Imam Nawawi, a Shafi'i jurist, he wrote it sort of a manual for preachers to improve the piety of laity, not as a legal source. But you know that text disembodied from any context of a Nawawi or why he wrote the book or what or his other famous legal text, Muhazzab, and it's a huge commentary on it known as Al-Majmu'. And he has also a book on Usul Fiqh. I mean, all of that is so. The fundamentalist act is I often see it as the word is a predator act. It's like a predator upon the tradition, because it scans a tradition to find an angle. It's in a way it's sort of pornographic, you know, because it's obscene in its impression. You find an angle, and that angle is taken, and it is then puffed up into this reality. And so you are not a participant in the tradition, you are a predator upon the tradition. You're a parasite leashing off the tradition, and then resting on whatever symbols you've co-opted, you then exercise in all type of dynamics that quite often have nothing to do with the tradition that you had co-opted. And it is, you know, when I first came to the United States, this was back in the early 80s when the Wahhabi movement was still spreading within Islamic centers in the United States, and Saudi Arabia was pouring in money and so on. And I would increasingly, by 1986, I struck by the number of young people I would encounter who would tell me, okay, I want to say X, Y, and Z. Can you give me a few Quranic verses or some hadiths that would support my position? And it is like one of these moments of conscious transformation and self-introspection that really, you know, what paradigm you need to be in to think that way. I mean, you're even a predator upon your own text, your own holy text, the Quran itself. Now, of course, Tariq Ali would say, well, that's the affair of religion. That is never any different. But you know, when someone like Roberto Unger, the reason I keep mentioning him is just because I responded to him in the Tanner lectures right before I came, so he's just on my mind. Who, you know, talks about the transformative power of religion, and he says he wants a secular religion based on the divinity of the individual. Well, in that, it is you can't have it both ways. You can't say, well, the transformative power of religion has always been a predator movement. I mean, to use my terminology, that has never really cared for a comprehensive states of consciousness or inspiring normative dreams, hopes that you want to reach out but at the same time say, well, you know, it's a powerful moving tradition, and religion moves everything, but But so let's take the religious the religious consciousness